Hands on the hood. Do it now! I am standing right here. What is the problem?
He thought it was just another man who didn't belong. A quiet hospital parking lot. A uniform. A badge. And one assumption that changed everything. The officer escalated. The commands piled up. The camera kept rolling. What he didn't know was that the man he was cornering wasn't a civilian. He was a police lieutenant. And this 10-minute encounter would end a career that took 6 years to build. Watch closely. What are you doing out here? This your car? The question rang out emphatically in the hospital's underground parking lot, where fluorescent lights cast a cold, empty concrete glow. The man standing next to the car turned around, his hands still clutching the keys, neither startled nor panicked. It's mine. I'm visiting my brother. He's in the ER. His voice was even, slow, and showed no sign of evasion. Yeah? You got ID on you. The officer took another half step, the distance between them now less than 2 meters. The camera mounted on. His chest was pointed directly at the man's face. Yes, sir. Visitor badge right here. The man slightly raised his hand, pointing to his chest where the hospital access badge was still dangling. Hands where I can see them. Don't reach. The command cut short, sharp and dry, leaving no room for explanation. The atmosphere instantly changed. It was no longer a question. This was control. I'm just showing you the badge you asked for. The man paused, lowering his hands to his hips, opening them wide. He neither stepped back nor forward. He simply stood still. I said don't reach. What's the real reason you're hanging out here? The officer's voice stiffened, as if the previous answer hadn't existed. The reason is my family, the man replied, his eyes never leaving the other person. I'm going inside now. He turned slightly toward the hospital entrance, a natural, unhurried movement. Not so fast. The officer raised his voice. Before I make sure you belong here. Turn around. The man paused. I'm not under arrest. You don't have. Give me your hands now. Hey. The shout echoed off the bare concrete, shattering the silence of the parking lot. The officer's hand was now closer to his waist, locked in a tight grip, as if the decision had been made long ago. In less than a minute, a visitor to a hospital is placed in a position where they must prove they belong here. And the cameras are recording every second. The officer standing in front of the man was Cole Wright, 30, a patrol officer who had served nearly 6 years in the department. Long enough to be accustomed to night shifts, long enough to no longer need supervision, but young enough to still possess a need to assert control in every encounter. In internal performance reviews, Wright was often described as proactive and unafraid to give orders early. Those words sound positive on paper, but in reality, they often come with a very specific type of behavior, forcing a situation to go in one's favor, even without clear reason. Several complaints have been recorded in previous years, mostly revolving around Wright's confrontational behavior when the person being examined asked questions or failed to immediately comply. None of them had enough evidence to warrant disciplinary action, but the notes remained, silently waiting for the moment when things could no longer be ignored. In the hospital parking lot that evening, Wright didn't see a visitor preparing to see a relative. He saw a situation that required control. His stance suggested it: square shoulders, legs apart, deliberately shortened distance. His hands remained at his waist, ready for the next move if the other person didn't comply. Wright's tone of voice reflected that habit. No open-ended questions, no explanations, just command after command, given as if the authority to command itself were sufficient. To him, a man stopping, explaining, and then questioning the reason for the inspection was not a sign of cooperation. It was a challenge. And for officers like Wright, challenges are rarely handled through dialogue. They are more often handled through escalation. The man standing beside the car, facing the increasingly harsh barrage of orders, was Reuben Knox Calder, 42 years old, a police lieutenant with nearly 20 years in the force. He had worked long enough to understand every stage of a street confrontation, from the opening question, the wrong escalation, to the moment when power is used instead of legal basis. Calder didn't state his rank, nor did he make any gestures to intimidate the person opposite him. There was no commanding tone, no provocative attitude, no gestures of authority. Instead, he stood still, maintaining a safe distance, his hands clearly visible, his voice even and low. It wasn't submission. It was discipline. Years earlier, Calder had been trained that in unprovoked inspection stops, a strong reaction would only give the other side the excuse they were looking for. So he chose a different approach. He answered concisely, neither too much nor too little. He asked precisely the question, the reason, nothing more. That evening, Calder arrived at the hospital not as an officer, but as an older brother. He had just received a text message that his younger brother had been taken to the emergency room. He parked his car, turned off the engine, took a deep breath before going inside, bracing himself for what awaited him behind the hospital doors. He didn't expect the first challenge to come from the parking lot. For Calder, this moment was sadly familiar. He had witnessed it from the other side before, read reports, watched body cam footage of contacts that began like this. He knew that how he behaved in the next few minutes would determine whether the situation would end peacefully or spiral out of control. And so, he maintained one thing: absolute composure. The east parking lot of Riverton Falls Memorial Hospital isn't a place for confrontations. It's a transitional space where people pause for a few minutes to catch their breath before venturing into the anxious corridors inside. White lights illuminate the silent rows of cars, the sound of engines rising and falling, leaving behind a heavy, unique stillness of the hospital at night. Calder had driven in less than 10 minutes earlier. He wasn't in a hurry, wasn't speeding, and wasn't breaking any of the posted regulations. He parked neatly in the empty space, turned off the engine, and looked down at his phone, replying to a short text message from family. It only took a few seconds to decide whether to go straight to the emergency room or linger a little longer to prepare himself. At that very moment, footsteps echoed on the concrete. Not hurried, but decisive. When Calder looked up, the first thing he saw wasn't a face, but a camera mounted on the chest of a police uniform, pointed directly at him. From the start, this wasn't a casual conversation. There were no parking signs, no area restrictions, no prior radio calls had been made reporting the incident. Yet an assumption was forming, an assumption unspoken, but evident in the prolonged, scrutinizing gaze, in the way the questions were asked, accusations rather than inquiries. In this parking lot, in the middle of a hospital where people come for the most legitimate reasons, Calder suddenly finds himself having to explain his presence. And that speaks more about the situation at hand than about any of his actions. This isn't a public waiting area. The officer's voice was even but carried an assertive tone, as if it were an obvious truth. You need to explain why you're here. He glanced at the car, then turned back to Calder, his gaze lingering longer than necessary, as if searching for something incongruous. Calder leaned slightly, remaining in place. I'm lawfully parked. I'm going into the hospital. The answer was brief, without justification or argument. Just a fact. But that answer was unacceptable. The officer took another half step, closing the distance. That's not what I asked. His voice was lower and more strained. Step away from the vehicle. On what basis? Calder repeated, his voice unchanged. He didn't raise his hand, didn't back down, just turned enough to face him directly, showing that he was listening but not ready to obey an unwarranted command. At that moment, the officer's patience vanished. He breathed heavily through his nose, his jaw clenched. Because you don't look like you're supposed to be here. The words weren't emphasized, nor did they need to be spoken loudly. They were released softly, as if it were an obvious fact that he believed everyone understood. There were no direct insults, no overtly discriminatory words, but the meaning was clear. In the officer's view, Calder's presence itself was suspicious. Calder didn't react. He didn't shake his head. He didn't respond. He just stood there, his hands clearly visible, his gaze calm. Years in the industry had taught him that moments like these were fragile. A wrong reaction, however small, could be the reason everything that followed. And it was precisely this controlled silence that made the situation even more dangerous. To the officer, it wasn't calmness. It was defiance. After that statement, the atmosphere between the two men changed completely. The officer no longer sought an explanation. He began to seek obedience. Step away from the vehicle, he repeated, this time not as a request, but as the first step in a series of pre-planned actions. Calder didn't move. There's no reason for that, he said. His voice still even, no higher than before. He knew exactly what was going on. An order without a legal basis wasn't meant for safety. It was meant to provoke a reaction. "I'm giving you a lawful order," the officer replied immediately. That familiar phrase was thrown out like a shield, though there was nothing to prove its lawful nature. Calder turned completely around, maintaining his distance. "On what basis?" he asked again. That was the moment the officer felt his authority being challenged. He didn't answer the question. Instead, he took another step forward, narrowing Calder's personal space, his voice sharper. "I asked you a question, and instead of answering, you're being difficult." "I'm not being difficult," Calder replied. "I'm asking why I'm being stopped." This hit the nail on the head, because up until now, no reason had been given. The officer leaned forward, his eyes quickly glancing down at Calder's waist before looking up again. "Do you have any weapons on you?" The question wasn't asked because of any apparent danger, but because escalation required a new pretext. "I'm not answering that," Calder said. "There's no lawful stop." Immediately, the officer's posture stiffened. His hand slid closer to his waist, his voice lowered but heavier. "That's not how this works." Calder looked him straight in the eye. "It is when there's no cause." Those two words hung suspended in the cold concrete space, enough to draw a clear line between law and self. And at that line, the officer made his choice. "You can either cooperate," he said slowly, "or I can detain you and figure it out myself." It was no longer a warning. It was a threat wrapped in business language. And from that moment, the path to escalation was officially opened. The atmosphere fell silent for a brief moment, as if both understood this was the point at which they could diverge. Calder took a slow breath, then spoke, his voice still under control. "You asked if I would cooperate. I was about to show you my identification." He reached into his jacket pocket, the movement slow and deliberate, pausing midway to ensure the officer was watching. "Don't," a voice snapped immediately. The officer's hand instinctively reached for his belt. Calder stopped abruptly, withdrew his hand, and said without argument, "You told me not to move." I stopped. Another moment of silence. Then the officer nodded briefly. "Go ahead." Slowly, Calder took out his wallet, opened it, and held it against his chest, close enough for the camera to capture. As soon as the wallet opened, a badge was clearly visible, unambiguous, and without exaggeration. The officer glanced at it for less than a second. "That doesn't mean anything," he said, his voice dry and cold. "People carry fake badges all the time. No curiosity, no attempt at verification, just a blunt denial." Calder blinked once, then looked straight at him. "Then verify it." The statement wasn't a challenge, but the only reasonable offer in this situation. A radio call, a question to the control center. 1 minute would suffice. But the officer did nothing. He didn't touch the radio. He didn't ask for backup. He didn't call for supervision. Instead, he took half a step forward. "Step away from the vehicle and put your hands behind your back." Calder didn't move. "No," he said curtly. No raising his voice. No sudden movement. Just a refusal based on legal understanding. In that moment, the path to stopping was completely closed. The camera on the officer's chest continued to record steadily, capturing every glance, every pause, every choice made. And in that choice, the officer decided not to turn back. The parking space no longer belonged solely to the two of them. A car slowly rolled past behind them. The driver glanced back, then continued on. Near the staircase, a woman stopped, her phone raised higher than before, no longer concealing the fact that she was recording. Every movement was slow, but the impact was clear. The officer realized it. His eyes darted quickly around the people nearby before returning to Calder, his jaw tightening. The presence of a witness always complicates things. It doesn't lessen the pressure. It amplifies it. "I told you," he growled, moving closer. His hand touched Calder's arm, just enough force to assert control, pulling him half a step away from the car door. "Hands behind your back." His voice now shifted to the formal tone that often appeared in subsequent reports. Calder maintained his balance, neither struggling nor pushing back. He let his arms hang loosely by his sides, neither cooperating nor resisting. "You're detaining me without cause," he said. His voice was flat, emotionless, as if he were repeating something all too familiar. "You were warned. Veen si quan dap. Now you're being detained until I figure out what's going on." For parking, Calder Hoylai. For refusing to cooperate. The difference between those two answers wasn't just the wording. One was a legal act. The other was an excuse. And the officer was choosing the excuse. From a distance, a hospital employee in scrubs slows down, their eyes following the scene. Unfolding. At the edge of the frame, a hospital security guard appears, stopping a few meters away, observing. Each new person who appears represents a new layer of witness. The officer sensed it. He shifted his body, trying to block Calder's view, as if to control the entire space. But the eyes were there, and the cameras, from various angles, had begun recording the same story. The officer raised his hand to the radio. The movement was decisive, as if it were the final formalization step. "Dispatch," he said, his voice becoming unusually formal. "I've got a non-compliant male refusing to follow lawful orders in the east parking structure. Stand by." Those words weren't random. Non-compliant, refusing, lawful orders. Each word carried its own weight, designed to paint a picture quite different from what the camera was capturing. In those few seconds of broadcast, a man standing still, his hands clearly visible, became a problematic subject. Calder didn't interrupt. He didn't retort over the radio. He knew any explanation at this point could be seen as disruptive. Instead, he maintained his posture, his gaze straight ahead. His body relaxed but alert, the stance of someone accustomed to having their every move scrutinized. A slight crackling sound came from the radio. "Unit 214, copy. What's the nature of the detention?" The officer hesitated for a very brief moment, then replied, "Suspicious activity. Individual refusing to identify." "That's not accurate," Calder said softly, loud enough for the camera to capture, but not loud enough to escalate into a public argument. The officer didn't respond. He had chosen his story and was now pursuing it. He pressed the button again, requesting a second unit. The request echoed dryly in the concrete space. It was the moment when the situation, which had already been pushed too far, officially slipped out of one person's control. On the other side of the parking lot, the woman near the stairs held her phone higher, the frame more stable. The hospital security guard stood still, hands clasped in front of his chest, his eyes fixed on the two men. What was being said on the radio was creating a story, but what was being recorded from multiple cameras told a completely different story. The sound of tires echoed through the parking lot as the second unit pulled in. A patrol car stopped a few meters away. The young officer stepped out, his eyes scanning the scene with a fast, ingrained habit. He saw their positions, the distance between them, Calder's arm hanging by his side, and Wright's hand still very close to his waist. "Hey," he said, his voice lower, not directed at anyone in particular. "What's going on?" "He won't cooperate," Wright replied immediately. "Claims he doesn't have to." The second officer didn't answer immediately. He looked at Calder again, longer. His gaze lingered on the open wallet in Calder's hand, then rose to his face. "You good?" he asked, not sharply, not commandingly. "I am," Calder nodded slightly. The second officer turned to Wright. "Did you run him?" The question was asked as a basic procedure, not a challenge. But Wright immediately froze. "I'm handling it." That moment was enough to create a crack. The young officer said nothing more. But his expression changed. He moved a little closer, close enough to see inside the wallet without touching it. A quick glance, then another. "That looks departmental," he said, not raising his voice. Wright spun around. "People fake that stuff all the time." "Yeah," the second officer replied slowly, "but not usually like that." A prolonged silence ensued between the two men. Not a silence of agreement, but of deliberation. In those few seconds, it became clear that not everyone saw the same threat. And when that happened, the narrative Wright was trying to construct began to show undeniable cracks. The radio crackled again, this time without a hint of confusion. "Unit 214, Supervisor is en route." Wright pressed the confirmation button immediately. But his voice was different now. No longer sharp. No longer urgent. Only a sense of urgency masked by professionalism. Calder stood still. He didn't use the moment to say anything more. He understood perfectly. When a supervisor appeared, any words were superfluous. Only the truth, laid bare in full light, remained. Footsteps echoed from the other end of the parking lot. Heavy and steady, a stark contrast to the hurried pace before. A man in a command uniform stepped into the frame, his eyes already assessing the situation from a distance. He saw Wright's position. He saw the second officer standing slightly to one side. He saw the hospital security guard who hadn't left yet. And then he saw Calder. He slowed down. Just a beat. But enough for the camera to register. "Why is a lieutenant being detained in my parking structure?" he asked, his voice low, without emphasis. Simply a well-placed question. Wright turned around. "Sergeant," the supervisor's hand went up, not to give a command, but to stop. His gaze remained on Calder. "Knox," he called out the name. Calder nodded once. "Frank." No more words. No more words were needed. Silence descended upon the parking lot like a heavy curtain. The second officer lowered his eyes for a moment. The hospital security guard straightened his posture. The woman filming held her phone. Still, not moving. In that moment, the story Wright had tried to concoct on the radio crumbled completely. Not with arguments. Not with orders. But with a simple truth. The man being held was not someone who didn't belong here. He was a police lieutenant. And from that moment on, everything spiraled out of Wright's control. The supervisor was in no hurry. He paused for a moment, allowing every position and distance to become clear in front of the camera. "Lieutenant Calder," he said, this time in a formal tone. "Are you being detained?" "Yes," Calder replied. Not another word. No explanation needed. The supervisor nodded once. "You're not." He turned to Wright, his eyes turning cold. "Release him. Step back." Wright hesitated for a very brief moment. That moment was enough for the camera to capture. Then he let go and took a step back. Just one step, but enough to change everything. The control he had held from the beginning of the encounter vanished almost instantly. The supervisor turned to the second officer. "How long have you been on scene?" "About 2 minutes," he replied. "And in that time, I didn't observe anything that justified a detention." No one objected. The supervisor nodded, then turned to the hospital security officer. "Ma'am, I'm going to need your name. I also have this entire interaction on our cameras," she said. "That won't be necessary," he replied. "We already have enough." He turned back to Calder. "Are you all right?" "I am," Calder said, adjusting his coat. "I'll follow up with you tonight." "I expect you to," Calder replied. Calder walked towards the hospital entrance. No one stopped him. No one called after him. As he passed the woman filming, she lowered her phone slightly and nodded. Calder nodded back, then continued walking as if this were just an insignificant obstacle on his way to visit a relative. Only when Calder was out of frame did the supervisor turn to face Wright. "Badge number," he said. Wright read the number. "Keys." Wright paused for a second, then removed the keys from his belt and placed them in the supervisor's hand. "Suspended pending investigation," he continued. "Effective immediately." The standoff in the parking lot ended faster than it began. There was no arguing. No handcuffs. Just an officer standing silently. Keys no longer in his belt, and a camera continuing to record until the official end of his shift. What happened next is not to be guessed. Wright's body cam footage was extracted first, then the radio traffic, then the hospital's security camera system, recording the same sequence of events from multiple angles. Each video showed the same thing. No violation, no threat, no legal basis for stopping and detaining. An internal investigation was launched. Old, previously shelved complaints were brought up for review again. The familiar language appeared in every file. Premature escalation, unnecessary orders, negative reactions to questioning. This time, there was no room for oversight. 14 days later, Cole Wright's contract was terminated. A few days later, his professional license was permanently revoked. No lengthy press release. No names mentioned in the official statement. Just a brief statement. Breach of policy and professional standards. Reuben Knox Calder returned to work the following week. No disciplinary action. No note on his record. Life went on, as if the incident in the parking lot was just an unwanted interruption to an already stressful day filled with family. The hospital parking lot is still there. The lights are still on. People still come and go during the most vulnerable moments of their lives. But a video is archived, labeled, and used in future training sessions. Not to tell the story of someone shouting or a fight, but to show what abuse of power looks like when it's wrapped in a calm voice and proper commands. If this story makes you think, please share it. Comment where you saw it. Because sometimes, justice doesn't come from the person who talks the most, but from the truth that is recorded patiently and undeniably.